They tell you Terra is eternal, that the throne world stands inviolate at the heart of the Imperium, that the Emperor's palace will endure until the stars themselves grow cold and die. They tell you this in the Schola Progenium, in the academies where they shape children into officers and administrators, in the temples where the faithful gather to prostrate themselves before gilded icons and whisper prayers that echo through vaulted chambers built from the bones of ancient wars. They tell you Terra is untouchable, and you believe them because belief is easier than acknowledging that everything you've been taught, everything you've devoted your existence to, rests upon foundations no more permanent than morning frost on glass. My name is Corvus Aldrin, and I served as a senior lexicographer in the Historium Imperialis, one of 10,000 functionaries whose task was to catalogue and preserve the official records of mankind's achievements across the galaxy. I spent 37 years in that role, working in archives that burrowed deep beneath the surface of Terra, surrounded by data stacks that reached from floor to ceiling in chambers so vast their far walls disappeared into perpetual gloom. My colleagues and I processed reports from a million worlds, sorting fact from propaganda, truth from expedient fiction, maintaining the elaborate mythology that held the Imperium together through sheer weight of accumulated narrative. I was good at my work. Exceptional, even. I received commendations from archivists senior to me, earned increases in my stipend allowance, gained access to restricted sections where the most sensitive records were maintained behind vault doors, sealed with mechanisms designed by tech priests who understood security protocols at levels approaching religious obsession. I read accounts of wars that had consumed entire sectors, of plagues that rendered worlds lifeless, of Xenos threats that emerged from the darkness between stars with appetites that beggared human comprehension. I processed these horrors with clinical detachment, reducing atrocity to data, cataloging extinction with the same methodical precision I applied to recording agricultural tithe fulfillment rates. The Tyranids were a recurring subject in my work, their activities documented in reports that arrived with increasing frequency over the decades of my service. Hive fleet after hive fleet, each designated with a name that pretended at classification while masking the existential dread their presence inspired. Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and dozens more, waves of biological horror that crashed against the Imperium's borders like tides eroding a shoreline. I read reports of worlds stripped to bedrock, of populations consumed down to the last screaming infant, of ecosystems reduced to sterile wasteland in the space of weeks as the Tyranids fed and moved on, growing stronger with each conquest, learning from each battle, adapting with speed that suggested intelligence orders of magnitude beyond simple animal cunning. The reports troubled me initially, particularly the analyses that showed hive fleet approach vectors, predictive models that traced potential trajectories through the galaxy. But the Historium's senior archivists maintained that Terra remained safe, protected by layered defenses that had held for 10,000 years, surrounded by fortress worlds and naval installations and space marine chapter homeworlds that formed concentric rings of protection around humanity's cradle. The Tyranids might ravage the Imperium's fringe territories, might consume entire sectors on the eastern fringe, or trouble the galactic south, but they would never reach Terra. Could never reach Terra. The mathematics of distance and defense made it impossible. I believed this, as I believed all the comfortable certainties that made my existence bearable, until the day I was summoned to the Lord Archivist's private chambers and shown data that had been classified at levels I had never previously encountered. The summons came via a servitor whose face had been replaced entirely with a mechanical vox unit, its message delivered in binary that my implanted translator converted to Gothic. Attend immediately. No delay permitted. Inform no colleagues of summons. The Lord Archivist's chambers occupied a section of the Historium I had never entered, accessed through corridors that required biometric authentication at 3 separate checkpoints, each manned by guards whose augmented bodies and ceremonial weapons suggested they were something more than ordinary security personnel. The final chamber was small, almost intimate compared to the vast archives where I normally worked, furnished with a single desk behind which sat Lord Archivist Malthus Vex, a man I had seen perhaps 5 times in my 3 decades of service, always at distance during ceremonial occasions. He was ancient, his face a landscape of wrinkles and age spots, His eyes filmed with cataracts that I suspected were deliberately cultivated to appear blind, while augmented sensors behind them tracked everything with mechanical precision. He gestured for me to sit without offering preliminary pleasantries, his movements economical, his expression suggesting a man who had dispensed with social niceties decades ago and had never regretted their absence. "You have appropriate clearance," he said, not as question but as statement requiring confirmation. I nodded, displayed my credentials on a data slate that he examined with eyes that suddenly seemed far less clouded than they had appeared initially. He grunted satisfaction, made a gesture toward a holo display that materialized above his desk, showing a star chart of such complexity that it took me several seconds to orient myself, to recognize the patterns as representing not a small sector but the entire galaxy, rendered in three-dimensional space with trajectory lines marked in colors that coded for different threat classifications. Red lines dominated the display, hundreds of them, thousands, converging toward the galactic core from multiple vectors, surrounding Terra like a closing fist. Hive fleets. I realized with mounting horror. Every documented Tyranid incursion rendered visible simultaneously, their paths traced backward to origin points beyond the galaxy's edge and projected forward using predictive models that showed not possibility but inevitability. The lines converged, and at their convergence point, marked with the golden icon that represented humanity's throneworld, Terra waited like prey that had not yet understood it was being hunted. "This is classified beyond your current clearance," Vex said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering a death sentence with bureaucratic precision. "But circumstances require expansion of information access protocols. You need to understand what is happening so that you can fulfill the function I am assigning to you." I stared at the display, my mind refusing to process what my eyes clearly showed. "The projections must be wrong," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded distant, as if someone else was speaking through my mouth. "The defenses, the fortress worlds, the Navy, are irrelevant," Vex interrupted, not harshly but with the flat certainty of someone stating physical law. "The Tyranids are not approaching Terra through normal space, they are coming through the webway." The statement made no sense initially, contradicted everything I understood about the alien race whose records I had catalogued for decades. The Tyranids traveled through real space, crossing the void between stars in ships that were themselves living organisms, breeding fleets that moved with the patient inevitability of astronomical phenomena. They didn't use the webway. The ancient Eldar transit network was closed to them, incompatible with their biology, protected by mechanisms that had endured since before humanity achieved spaceflight. Vex watched my confusion with something that might have been sympathy, though his expression remained predominantly grim. "6 months ago, we received reports from a remote monitoring station near the Cadian Gate," he said, each word measured, careful, as if he was rationing information like precious water in a desert. "They detected seismic disturbances in the webway itself, vibrations that suggested something was moving through the tunnels, something massive, organized, deliberately navigating rather than mindlessly wandering. The station's final transmission, before contact was lost, reported visual confirmation of Tyranid organisms emerging from a webway portal, not mindless beasts, but creatures that appeared to have been modified to survive in that environment." He gestured, and the holo display shifted, showing grainy picked capture of something that my mind struggled to categorize. Tyranid organisms, certainly, recognizable by their characteristic biological architecture, but changed, adapted, their bodies covered with structures that resembled the psychocrystalline materials of the webway itself, as if they had incorporated the tunnel's substance into their own biology. They moved with purpose through corridors that should have been hostile to their existence, navigating with precision that suggested they understood where they were going, understood what they were hunting. "The webway network is compromised," Vex continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "We don't know how extensively, don't know how many entrance points the Tyranids have discovered, don't know how long they've been adapting themselves to navigate it, but predictive models suggest that within 6 months, possibly less, they will locate and emerge from one of the portals that connect directly to Terra." When that happens, the Tyranids will bypass every defense we've prepared, will materialize inside the Imperial Palace itself, will strike at humanity's heart before anyone realizes the threat has arrived. I sat motionless, my mind refusing to accept what he was telling me, while simultaneously understanding that denial changed nothing, that truth operated independently of my willingness to acknowledge it. "What do we do?" I asked, though I suspected the answer was nothing, that we were discussing not prevention but documentation, recording the end for archival purposes even as the end consumed us. Vex reached into his desk, produced a data crystal that gleamed like a frozen tear, held it out toward me with a hand that trembled slightly despite his evident attempt at steadiness. "You document," he said simply. "You record everything that happens from this moment forward, so that if anything survives, if any fragment of humanity endures beyond Terra's fall, there will be a record of what occurred, how it happened, why our defenses failed. This crystal contains access codes to restricted archives, authorization to move freely through sectors that will be locked down once the attack begins, permission to observe and record without interference from security protocols or military authorities. You are now the historian's primary witness to whatever transpires." I took the crystal with fingers that felt numb, disconnected from my body, the small object seeming to weigh far more than its physical mass could account for. "Why me?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't certain I wanted to know the answer. "Because you're competent," Vex replied with brutal honesty. "Because your records show you can function under stress without succumbing to hysteria. Because you have no family to distract you. No close relationships that would compromise your objectivity. Because someone must bear witness, and I have chosen you for that burden. Consider it both honor and curse, as you prefer." He dismissed me then, waving me away with a gesture that suggested exhaustion, that implied he had delivered this briefing to others and found the repetition draining. I walked back through the secure corridors in a state of dissociation, my mind simultaneously racing and completely blank, unable to formulate coherent thought beyond the single recurring image of those red trajectory lines converging on Terra, on the golden icon that represented everything humanity claimed to be, everything we told ourselves we had built and defended and would preserve until the end of time itself. The end of time, it seemed, was scheduled to arrive within 6 months. I returned to my duties with a sense of unreality that never fully dissipated, going through the familiar motions of cataloging and processing while carrying the weight of knowledge that separated me from my colleagues as thoroughly as if I had been physically removed to another world. They worked around me, complaining about the usual frustrations, missing data, corrupted files, reports that contradicted each other, the endless bureaucratic tedium that defined our existence. They didn't know that their complaints were about to become permanently irrelevant, that all the records we so carefully maintained would likely be consumed along with everything else, reduced to organic matter that would feed the Tyranid swarm's endless hunger. I monitored restricted channels using the access codes Vex had provided, reading reports that documented the Imperium's desperate attempts to address the threat without triggering the mass panic that would result if the general population learned that Terra itself was targeted. Naval fleets were being repositioned with excuses about training exercises and patrol route adjustments. Space Marine chapters were being summoned to the throneworld under pretense of ceremonial duties and strategic consultations. The Custodian Guard, those 10,000 warriors who had not left Terra in millennia, were conducting drills with frequency that must have seemed excessive to anyone paying attention. But these preparations were performative more than practical, gestures toward defense that everyone with appropriate clearance understood were inadequate. How do you defend against an enemy that can materialize inside your stronghold, that bypasses walls and guns and void shields by traveling through dimensions you barely understand and cannot effectively monitor? The webway portals on Terra were ancient, their locations known, but their mechanisms incompletely understood, reliant on technology that predated the Imperium by tens of thousands of years. The Mechanicus had assigned tech priests to analyze and secure these portals, but their liturgies and blessed oils seemed pathetic responses to threat of this magnitude. The first indication that the crisis had accelerated beyond our worst predictions came 3 months after my meeting with Vex, earlier than any model had suggested. evidence that the Tyranids were moving faster than expected, or that our understanding of their capabilities remained dangerously incomplete. I was working a night shift. Time became increasingly arbitrary as the threat approached, with personnel working whatever hours allowed them to avoid thinking about impending catastrophe, when alarms began screaming through the Historium with volume and urgency I had never heard before, not even during drills. The Vox network erupted with conflicting reports. Fragments of information that painted a picture of chaos spreading through multiple sectors of the palace simultaneously. Webway portals were opening spontaneously, disgorging Tyranid organisms into chambers that had been secure moments before. Creatures adapted for close quarters combat, emerging into corridors filled with panicking personnel who had spent their entire lives believing such invasion was impossible. I accessed picked feeds from security servitors, watching grainy footage of battles erupting in throne rooms and archive chambers and residential quarters, watching defenders trying to establish firing lines while being overwhelmed by waves of organisms that moved with coordinated precision, that adapted their tactics in real time as they encountered different resistance patterns. I activated the recording equipment that Vex had authorized me to carry, a sophisticated augmetic implant that had been surgically installed in my skull the day after our meeting, allowing me to document everything I witnessed through direct neural interface. The installation had been agonizing despite anesthetic protocols, but pain seemed like a trivial concern now as I moved through corridors that were transforming from familiar workspace into war zone, following my authorization codes toward areas where the fighting was most intense, driven by the mandate to witness and record, even as every survival instinct screamed at me to flee. The smell hit me first as I approached the contested areas, a biological stench unlike anything I had encountered before, sweet and rotten simultaneously. Organic decay, mixed with chemical signatures that suggested alien biochemistry, metabolic processes that followed rules incompatible with Terran biology. The smell intensified as I moved deeper into the combat zones, becoming almost visible in its intensity, coating my throat with residue that made breathing difficult and tasted like spoiled meat mixed with industrial solvent. I rounded a corner and saw my first Tyranid organism in person rather than through picked capture or artistic rendering, and the reality was so much worse than any image had prepared me for. The creature was perhaps 3 meters tall, its body structure suggesting both insect and vertebrate predator, covered in chitinous armor that glistened with moisture that might have been blood or some other fluid. Its head was elongated, eyeless, dominated by a mouth that seemed to occupy most of its skull, filled with teeth that looked like they had been designed by a sadist who understood that death could be prolonged through careful application of tearing rather than clean cuts. It was feeding on a body when I saw it, tearing chunks of flesh from a corpse I recognized as belonging to one of my colleagues. Consuming the meat with efficiency that suggested hunger was not driving its actions so much as programmatic requirement to convert all available organic matter into usable resources. The creature sensed my presence. I still don't understand how, given its apparent lack of eyes or conventional sensory organs, and turned toward me with speed that defied its size, moving from feeding position to attack posture in a fraction of a second. I stood frozen, my recording equipment capturing everything while my body refused to respond to commands to run, to hide, to do anything except stand and witness as the creature approached with movements that were simultaneously alien and terribly graceful, biological efficiency refined across millions of years of evolution toward perfect predation. It would have killed me if a bolt round hadn't removed its head from its shoulders, the explosive projectile detonating inside the creature's skull with a wet crunch that splattered brain matter across the corridor walls. A space marine emerged from a side passage, his armor bearing the heraldry of a chapter I didn't immediately recognize, his weapon already tracking toward other targets I couldn't see, but could hear chittering in the darkness beyond the failing lumen strips. "Move," he commanded, his Vox-amplified voice cutting through the ambient chaos with authority that compelled immediate obedience. I moved, following him as he advanced into the contested section, watching him engage organisms that appeared from side passages and ventilation ducts and ceiling hatches, his movements precise and economical despite the armor's bulk, each shot calculated to maximize lethality while conserving ammunition. He killed 17 organisms in the space of perhaps 2 minutes, clearing a corridor that had been completely overrun moments before, his presence transforming chaos into controlled violence. But even as he fought, Even as his expertise carved temporary safety from the swarm, I could see that he was barely holding position rather than making progress, that for every organism he killed, more appeared to replace them, emerging from the webway portals in numbers that suggested this was not a raid but an invasion, not a probe, but a full-scale assault intended to overwhelm through sheer biomass rather than tactical sophistication. "Why aren't you armed?" the Space Marine demanded during a brief pause in the combat, his attention dividing between me and the corridor we had just cleared. I explained my role, showed him my authorization credentials, watched his expression, what little I could see through his helmet's visor, shift to something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "Document this then," he said, turning back toward the sounds of combat that were growing louder, closer, coming from multiple directions simultaneously. "Document that we fought, that we stood against this, that humanity did not go quietly into extinction." He advanced back into the killing zone without waiting for response, and I followed because my mandate required it, because bearing witness meant being present, even when presence meant proximity to death. The battle for the Historium for my section of the palace lasted 14 hours by chronometric measurement, though subjectively it felt like weeks, like months, time dilating under the weight of sustained horror until each moment stretched into eternity. The Space Marine, whose name I never learned, died after 6 hours, overwhelmed by a swarm of smaller organisms that pulled him down through sheer mass, tearing at his armor's joints until they found vulnerable points, feeding on him even as he crushed them with his bare hands, fighting until the moment his heart stopped beating and beyond, his body's final convulsions killing 3 more organisms before his systems finally surrendered to catastrophic damage. I witnessed hundreds of deaths during those hours. Watched people I had worked alongside for decades torn apart by creatures that treated human bodies as nothing more than raw material to be processed, consumed, incorporated into biomass that would fuel the swarm's expansion. I watched defenders make heroic stands that delayed the inevitable by minutes or seconds, watched them die knowing they had achieved nothing except slightly slower extinction. I watched the Historium, that repository of 10,000 years of human achievement, that carefully maintained record of everything we had been and done and dreamed, reduced to carrion feeding ground, the data stacks torn apart by organisms that seemed to understand destroying our records was as important as consuming our bodies, eliminating not just our present, but our documented past. The smell of biological decay intensified throughout the battle, becoming the dominant sensory experience, overwhelming everything else until breathing felt like drowning in rot, until the stench seemed to have physical weight that pressed down on my chest and made each inhalation a conscious effort. I vomited repeatedly during the early hours, my body rejecting the sensory overload, but eventually I had nothing left to expel and continued dry heaving while recording, while documenting, while fulfilling the function Vex had assigned me, even as I suspected it was pointless, that no one would ever review these records because there would be no one left to review anything. The Tyranids adapted as they fought, their tactics evolving in real time as they encountered different defensive strategies, learning from each engagement and applying those lessons immediately. I watched them develop countermeasures to bolter fire, observed them adjusting their approach patterns to minimize exposure, saw them begin targeting defenders' ammunition supplies and forcing reloads at tactically disadvantageous moments. The speed of adaptation was terrifying, not just for its effectiveness, but for what it implied about the intelligence directing the swarm, the vast consciousness that processed battlefield data and adjusted strategies across thousands of organisms simultaneously, treating combat like a scientist might treat an experiment, testing variables and refining hypotheses until optimal solutions emerged. I retreated deeper into the Historium as sections fell, following the shifting defensive lines, recording everything while trying to maintain enough distance to avoid becoming target myself. My status as unarmed non-combatant seemed to provide some protection. The Tyranids largely ignored me when armed defenders were present, focusing their attention on threats rather than witnesses. But I understood this protection was temporary, that once the defenders were eliminated, I would be consumed as efficiently as anyone else, that bearing witness would end with my own death and the destruction of my recording equipment, rendering the entire exercise ultimately futile. Lord Archivist Vex found me after approximately 10 hours, emerging from a secure section I hadn't known existed, his appearance so unexpected that I initially thought I was hallucinating from stress and exhaustion. He looked worse than when I'd seen him 3 months prior, his face even more gaunt, his eyes hollow with knowledge that had clearly not granted him any peace. He carried a data case that I recognized as belonging to the most restricted archives, containing information classified beyond even my enhanced clearance. "Still recording?" he asked, and I nodded, unable to formulate verbal response. He made a gesture of approval, grim satisfaction evident despite the chaos surrounding us. "Good. The primary archives are lost, and most of the senior staff are dead. You may be the only one still documenting, which means your records are now the authoritative account. Come with me. There's something you need to witness before the end." He led me through service corridors I'd never known existed, passages hidden behind false walls and disguised as structural supports, navigating with certainty that suggested he had planned this route long before the invasion began. We descended, moving from the levels where the Historium occupied space into deeper sections of the palace, following stairs that seemed to spiral downward forever, counting floors until I lost track somewhere past the 100th level. The sounds of combat faded as we descended, replaced by something else, a vibration I felt more than heard, a subsonic rumbling that suggested massive activity somewhere below, as if the palace's foundations were being undermined, as if Terra itself was being hollowed out from within. Vex noticed my reaction to the vibrations, nodded grimly. "The Tyranids aren't just attacking the palace," he explained as we continued descending. "They're burrowing into Terra's crust, establishing what our analysts believe are digestion chambers, massive organic facilities where they can process biomass on planetary scale. They're not simply killing humanity, they're preparing to consume Terra itself, to strip the throne world down to bedrock and incorporate everything into their fleet. The sacred soil where mankind achieved sentience will become nutrients that fuel the swarm's expansion to other systems, other sectors, other segmentums. They're erasing not just our present but our origin." We reached a level that I estimated must be kilometers beneath the surface, entering a chamber so vast its boundaries disappeared into darkness that seemed absolute despite the lumen strips Vex activated. The chamber floor was organic rather than constructed, covered with a carpet of Tyranid biotecture living material that pulsed with visible peristaltic motion, transporting fluids and nutrients and other substances I couldn't identify through veins that glowed with bioluminescent light. The walls were similarly transformed, no longer the rockcrete and plasteel of Imperial construction, but rather something that looked like the interior of a massive organism, all moisture and rhythmic motion, and the overwhelming smell of alien biology. "They're converting Terra," Vex said unnecessarily, gesturing at the transformed space. "This was a storage chamber 24 hours ago, full of ammunition and supplies. Now it's this, and this is spreading, expanding, growing exponentially as more organisms emerge from the webway and begin the conversion process. Our analysts estimate that at current rates, the entire palace will be transformed within 72 hours. The surrounding hive structures will follow within a week. Terra as we know it, Terra as it has existed for tens of thousands of years, will cease to exist, replaced by a Tyranid digestion facility that processes everything we've built into raw materials for the hive fleet." I recorded it all, my augmetic implants capturing imagery and environmental data, documenting the transformation with clinical precision, while my conscious mind struggled to process the magnitude of what I was witnessing. This was not defeat in any conventional military sense, this was ontological erasure, the replacement of one form of existence with another, humanity being written over like text on a palimpsest, our civilization reduced to nutrients that would fuel something so alien that comparison to human experience failed at every level. "Why are we here?" I asked, though I suspected the answer was simply that Vex wanted me to document this particular horror, wanted it preserved in whatever records might somehow survive. "Because you need to understand the complete scope," Vex replied, moving deeper into the transformed chamber, stepping carefully on the organic floor that gave slightly beneath his weight, releasing small puffs of gas that smelled like ammonia mixed with decay. "You need to see not just the fighting but the aftermath, the consequences, the reality that lies beneath all our propaganda about humanity's manifest destiny and the Emperor's protection. Terra is falling, and no one is coming to save it. The Navy fleets are too distant, the Space Marines too scattered, the custodians too few. We are witnessing the end of everything the Imperium claimed to be, the revelation that all our certainty was delusion, that we were never invincible, never eternal, never anything more than organic matter waiting to be consumed by something more efficient at survival than we ever managed to be. A sound echoed through the transformed chamber, something between a shriek and a grinding mechanical roar, and I turned to see something emerging from the biotecture, something massive and terrible that my mind refused to properly categorize. It resembled a Tyranid organism in general architecture, but was far larger than anything I had seen before, perhaps 20 meters tall, its body covered with biological weapons that looked like they had been grown specifically for killing on unprecedented scale. It moved with ponderous grace, each step causing the organic floor to ripple, its eyeless head sweeping back and forth as if scanning for prey. "Hive tyrant," Vex said calmly, though I could hear the fear beneath his attempted clinical detachment. "Command organism. Its presence indicates this sector has been secured enough to warrant deployment of specialized controller creatures. We should not be here. We should leave immediately." But we didn't leave immediately. Couldn't leave immediately, because the Hive Tyrant had noticed us, had turned its attention toward us with focus that felt personal despite the alien intelligence behind it. It approached with increasing speed, closing the distance between us with movements that suggested certainty we could not escape, that resistance was pointless, that our deaths were inevitable and imminent. Vex made no attempt to run, simply stood and watched the creature approach with expression that suggested resignation rather than terror. "Record this," he commanded, his final words to me, his last contribution to the archives he had devoted his life to maintaining. "Record everything until the end. That's all we can do now. That's all we ever could do. Bear witness until we're silenced." The Hive Tyrant killed him with almost casual efficiency, one of its biological weapons firing a projectile that struck Vex in the chest and dissolved him from the inside out, reducing him to steaming organic slurry in the space of seconds. I stood frozen, recording, my augmetic implants capturing his death with perfect clarity, documenting the end of the man who had given me this terrible responsibility. The creature turned toward me next, and I understood that my own death was moments away, that my documentation would end with my consumption, that all my records would be lost unless I could somehow transmit them before dying. I triggered the emergency broadcast protocol that had been built into my augmetic implants, sending everything I had recorded over every available channel, flooding Imperial Vox networks with imagery and environmental data and sensory information, screaming my witness into the void and praying that someone, somewhere, would receive it and understand what had happened. The Hive Tyrant paused, its attention shifting from me to something else, some signal or imperative that superseded my immediate elimination. It turned away, moving deeper into the transformed chamber, leaving me alive for reasons I couldn't comprehend. Perhaps I was deemed too insignificant to waste resources on. Perhaps the swarm had more important targets. Perhaps I was being deliberately preserved to serve some function I couldn't anticipate. I didn't know, couldn't know. Didn't care because I was alive and still recording, and that was all that mattered. I fled then, abandoning any pretense of objective documentation, running back toward the stairs that Vex and I had descended, climbing with desperate energy that bordered on panic, my augmetic implants still recording even as conscious thought devolved into pure survival instinct. The sounds of combat grew louder as I ascended, indicating that fighting continued on the upper levels, that some defenders still held positions, that complete collapse had not yet occurred. I emerged into a scene of absolute chaos, a crossroads where multiple corridors intersected, all of them filled with combat, with defenders making last stands against waves of organisms that seemed endless, inexhaustible, always replaced by more that emerged from webway portals or climbed from the transformed sections below. I saw custodian guards fighting with weapons that had been blessed by the Emperor himself 10,000 years ago, their golden armor splattered with alien ichor, their movements precise even as they were slowly overwhelmed. I saw tech priests chanting prayers while servitors loaded weapons with mechanical efficiency, their augmented bodies continuing to function even as organic components failed. I saw ordinary humans, administrators and servants and personnel whose roles had never involved combat fighting with improvised weapons or bare hands, dying in heaps but refusing to surrender, refusing to make the slaughter easy. I recorded it all, my augmetic implants capturing the death of Terra's defenders, documenting heroism that would never be commemorated because there would be no one left to commemorate anything. The smell of death was overwhelming now, biological and mechanical decay mixing into an olfactory nightmare that made the earlier stench seem pleasant by comparison. Bodies carpeted the floor in places, human and Tyranid both, creating obstacles that fighters stumbled over, that organisms fed upon even as combat continued around them. Time lost meaning entirely as the battle continued, hours blurring together until I could no longer distinguish one moment from another, could no longer remember what it felt like to experience anything except terror and witness, fear and documentation. My conscious mind retreated to some protected space deep inside, leaving only the mandate to record, to bear witness, to fulfill the function Vex had assigned me, even though he was dead and his archives were destroyed, and the entire concept of historical preservation had become absurd in the face of extinction. I became aware that the sounds of combat were changing, diminishing, replaced by other noises, biological sounds, feeding sounds, the wet tearing of flesh being consumed and processed. The defenders were losing, had lost, were being systematically eliminated, or had already fallen, leaving only organisms to occupy the palace, to continue the transformation that would convert Terra from human world to Tyranid digestion facility. I found myself in a chamber I didn't recognize, a throne room perhaps, or an audience hall, some space designed for grandeur but now serving as feeding ground. Organisms moved through the space with purposeful coordination, dragging bodies to collection points where larger creatures waited to process the biomass, creating efficient systems that turned death into nutrients with industrial precision. I should have hidden, should have found some concealed space and waited for whatever end awaited me. But the mandate to document drove me forward, compelled me to approach one of the collection points, to record the process by which human bodies were being converted into raw material, to bear witness to the final indignity of consumption. The organisms ignored me as I approached, too focused on their function to register my presence as significant. I watched them work with horrified fascination, observed the efficiency with which they reduced complexity to simplicity, identity to anonymity, converting individuals into undifferentiated biomass that would be absorbed and transformed and incorporated into the swarm's endless expansion. I recognized one of the bodies being processed, a woman I had worked with for years, whose name I couldn't remember, whose face had been familiar across decades of shared labor in the Historium. Now she was simply meat, organic material being broken down and repurposed, her memories and experiences and accumulated knowledge meaningless to creatures that valued only nutritional content. Something broke inside me watching this. Some final barrier between clinical documentation and emotional horror collapsing completely. I began to weep, tears streaming down my face while my augmetic implants continued recording, capturing my breakdown with the same dispassionate precision they applied to everything else. I wept, not just for the woman being processed, not just for Vex and the Space Marine and all the others I had seen die, but for Terra itself, for humanity, for the comfortable certainty that we mattered in any cosmic sense, that our existence was anything more than temporary accommodation in a universe that would eventually reclaim everything we had built and been. I don't know how long I stood there weeping and recording before I became aware that something was different, that the quality of sound in the chamber had changed. The feeding noises had stopped. The organisms had ceased their processing activities. Everything had gone still, silent, as if the entire swarm was pausing to listen to something I couldn't hear. Then I felt it, a vibration that came not from the transformed palace but from something beyond, something deeper, something that suggested presence of scale that dwarfed even the invasion I had witnessed. The organisms began withdrawing, moving with coordinated precision back toward the webway portals, abandoning their feeding sites and collection points, responding to imperative that superseded their current activities. I followed them, drawn by curiosity that overwhelmed my terror, recording their movement as they streamed back through the portals in numbers that seemed to reverse the invasion, that suggested retreat or redeployment rather than continued conquest. Within an hour, the palace had been largely cleared of active organisms, though the biotecture transformation remained, though the bodies still carpeted floors and the smell of death still permeated everything. I accessed Vox channels that were somehow still functioning, listened to fragmentary reports from across Terra, from orbital stations, from naval vessels positioned at system's edge. The reports painted an impossible picture. The Tyranid assault had stopped not just in the palace but planet-wide, organisms withdrawing from every front simultaneously, retreating back through webway portals or into the transformed sections they had created. Naval observers reported that the Hive ships in high orbit were beginning to move away, turning toward the system's edge, departing with the same coordinated precision that had characterized their attack. Nobody understood why. Analysts offered theories that Terra's defenders had inflicted unacceptable casualties, that the Tyranids had achieved their objectives and were moving to new targets, that some signal from the Hive fleet beyond the system had recalled them. But all the theories felt inadequate. Insufficient explanations for behavior that defied everything we understood about Tyranid psychology, about the swarm's relentless appetite, about organisms that didn't retreat so much as pause between feeding phases. I remained in the throne room, recording the silence that followed the chaos, documenting the aftermath as thoroughly as I had documented the invasion. Bodies remained where they had fallen, the defenders whose sacrifice had achieved nothing except slight delay of the inevitable. The biotecture transformation remained. Vast sections of the palace converted to alien architecture that pulsed with residual life, even in the absence of active organisms. The smell remained, permeating everything, a permanent reminder of what had occurred. Survivors began emerging after several hours, crawling from hiding places and sealed sections, moving through the transformed palace with expressions that suggested they couldn't process what they were seeing, couldn't reconcile the evidence of catastrophic invasion with the fact that they remained alive. I recorded them as they wandered, captured their shock and confusion, their desperate attempts to find colleagues and loved ones among the bodies, their growing understanding that Terra had been wounded in ways that would never fully heal. The Administratum began organizing recovery operations within a day, establishing triage centers and casualty processing stations, attempting to restore order to chaos through familiar bureaucratic mechanisms. But the old certainties had been shattered. The comfortable belief in Terra's inviolability destroyed by organisms that had materialized inside the palace itself, that had killed with impunity, that had only stopped their assault for reasons that had nothing to do with our defensive capabilities. I submitted my recordings to the surviving archivists, watched them review the documentation with expressions that cycled through horror and fascination and eventual resignation. They classified everything at the highest levels, marked it for restricted access, ensured that the wider population would never know how close Terra had come to complete conquest, how thoroughly the Imperium's center had been violated. But I knew they couldn't contain the truth completely, that too many people had witnessed too much, that the transformed sections of the palace would serve as permanent reminders of what had occurred. The propaganda would claim victory, would describe the invasion as a failed attack, repelled by valiant defenders, would maintain the fiction of imperial invincibility. But those of us who had been present, who had witnessed the truth, would carry different knowledge that we had been judged and found wanting, that we had survived not through strength, but through incomprehensible mercy or indifference, that the Tyranids had demonstrated they could reach Terra whenever they chose and had chosen, for now, to depart rather than complete our consumption. The question that haunted me in the weeks and months that followed was simple. Why had they stopped? What had prompted their withdrawal? The analysts offered increasingly elaborate theories, but none felt adequate. None explained behavior that seemed to violate everything we understood about Tyranid psychology and biology. The answer, when it finally emerged from restricted intelligence briefings, was somehow worse than continued ignorance would have been. The Tyranids had stopped because they were done reconnoitering. They had achieved their actual objective, which was not conquest of Terra but understanding of Terra, mapping the planet's defenses, cataloging its population, analyzing its biological resources, gathering data that would inform future operations. The invasion had been an intelligence-gathering exercise, a probe rather than a serious assault, the swarm's way of testing responses and capabilities before committing to full-scale consumption. The organisms had fed not out of hunger, but as part of genetic sampling, collecting biological data from Terra's population, incorporating human DNA into their species' memory so they could develop optimal predation strategies for future encounters. The transformation of palace sections had been experimental, testing whether Terra's environment could support the biotecture processes they would need to deploy during actual invasion. Every death, every battle, every desperate stand had been nothing more than data collection, information feeding into Hive Mind's vast consciousness, refining strategies that would be deployed when the real attack eventually came. And the real attack was coming. Naval intelligence reported that the Hive fleets had not departed the system entirely but had merely retreated to staging areas beyond the system's edge, establishing positions that suggested they were preparing for something larger, more comprehensive, more terrible than the probe we had barely survived. They were gathering strength, breeding new organisms specifically adapted for Terra's environment, preparing assault that would not stop until the throneworld had been stripped to bedrock and incorporated into the Hive fleet's biomass. The Administratum's initial estimates suggested we had months, perhaps a year before the true invasion began. Those estimates were revised downward as more intelligence emerged, weeks rather than months, days rather than weeks, time collapsing toward inevitable conclusion with acceleration that suggested the Tyranids were not patient so much as thorough, that they would attack when preparation was complete, rather than when we expected. I continued my work in the Historium, cataloging records that seemed increasingly pointless, documenting history that would likely end within my lifetime. My colleagues went through familiar motions, filing reports and processing data, and maintaining archives as if routine could protect us from what was coming. The palace was gradually cleared of biotecture through procedures that involved burning it away with promethium, though the spaces that had been transformed never quite returned to normal, retaining subtle wrongness that suggested permanent corruption, alteration that couldn't be fully reversed. The transformed sections were eventually sealed rather than restored, blocked off behind doors marked with purity seals and warning sigils, becoming forbidden zones that personnel avoided without being explicitly ordered to do so. But I visited them sometimes, using my enhanced clearance to access areas others couldn't enter, standing in spaces that had been converted and partially reclaimed, trying to understand what I felt about what had happened. It wasn't fear exactly, though fear remained present beneath everything else. It was more like resignation, acceptance that we were living in borrowed time, that Terra's days were numbered, not in centuries or decades, but in weeks or days, that everything we did now was simply marking time until the real invasion began and finished what the probe had started. The smell lingered in those transformed sections, biological decay mixed with alien chemistry, organic processes that had left residues the Mechanicus couldn't fully analyze or neutralize. I stood breathing that smell, recording it through my augmetic implants, documenting the aftermath as thoroughly as I had documented the invasion itself. This was my function now, my purpose, the role Vex had assigned me, and that I continued to fulfill, even though he was dead, and the archives were compromised, and the entire concept of historical preservation had become absurd. I think about that smell sometimes, when I lie in my bunk unable to sleep, when the nightmares wake me and I find myself gasping for breath in darkness that seems threatening in ways it never did before. I think about how it represented change, transformation, the conversion of familiar into alien, the replacement of one form of existence with another. I think about how Terra itself now carries that smell in certain sections, how we've been marked by the invasion in ways that can't be erased, how we're already partially transformed even before the real attack begins. And I think about what will happen when the Tyranids return, when they emerge from the webway in numbers that make the probe seem insignificant, when they begin the full transformation that will convert Terra from humanity's cradle into nutrients that fuel the swarm's expansion. I think about whether anyone will remember that we existed, whether any fragment of our civilization will survive to bear witness that humanity once claimed this world, once built empires among the stars, once believed ourselves significant in any cosmic sense. My recordings will probably be destroyed when the real invasion comes, consumed along with everything else, reduced to biological components that will be processed and incorporated and rendered meaningless. But I continue recording anyway, continue documenting, continue fulfilling the mandate that has become my reason for existing. Because bearing witness is all we have left, all we ever had, the only response available to those who understand that resistance is futile but refuse to surrender without acknowledgement that something worth preserving existed, however briefly, before the darkness consumed it entirely. I am Corvus Aldrin. I was a senior lexicographer in the Historium Imperialis. I witnessed the first Tyranid invasion of Terra, documented its beginning and its temporary conclusion, recorded the transformation and violation of humanity's throne world. I am still here, still recording, still bearing witness while I wait for the real attack to begin, for the final invasion that will render all my documentation meaningless by eliminating everyone who might have reviewed it. The smell grows stronger each day, the biological residue spreading from the sealed sections, permeating more of the palace, suggesting that the transformation was never truly stopped, only slowed, that Terra is already being digested from within, even as we pretend to have survived. And when I sleep, when exhaustion finally overwhelms my insomnia, I dream of that vast transformed chamber kilometers beneath the surface, of the hive tyrant that spared me for reasons I still don't understand, of Vex dissolving into organic slurry while commanding me to record until the end. The end is coming. Everyone with appropriate clearance understands this, though we maintain the fiction of normality, though we continue our duties as if routine could protect us. The end is coming, and when it arrives, it will be absolute, no survivors, no escape, no fragments remaining to suggest humanity ever called Terra home. The Tyranids will consume everything, will incorporate our world into their fleet, will erase us from existence as thoroughly as if we had never been. But until that moment arrives, I will continue recording. I will document the waiting, the preparation, the desperate attempts to strengthen defenses that we know are inadequate. I will bear witness to the end of Terra, to the fall of the Imperium's heart, to the extinction of humanity's origin, because this is my function, my burden, my only remaining purpose, to record what happens when the Tyranids finally find Terra, when they return to complete what they began, when they reduce everything we were and built and believed to nutrients that fuel their endless hunger. And maybe, impossibly, against all probability, someone somewhere will receive these recordings. Maybe some fragment of humanity surviving in a distant sector will learn what happened to Terra, will understand that we fought even though fighting was futile, that we bore witness until we were silenced, that we refused to pretend our extinction was anything except what it was, the universe reclaiming space we had temporarily occupied, death wearing its truest face, the ultimate demonstration that consciousness and civilization and accumulated knowledge matter not at all when confronted with appetite vast enough to consume worlds. I am still recording. I am still here. I am still bearing witness while the smell grows stronger and the real invasion approaches and Terra counts down its final days. This is my testimony, my record, my contribution to archives that will probably be destroyed but must be maintained anyway, because the alternative is surrendering without acknowledgement, dying without protest, accepting extinction without forcing the universe to admit that something worth preserving existed before it was consumed. The Tyranids found Terra. They came, they fed, they departed to gather strength. They are returning, and when they do, everything ends not with glory or defiance or meaningful sacrifice, but with simple conversion of complexity to nutrients, identity to biomass, civilization to food that fuels something so alien that comparison fails. I am documenting this end. I am recording humanity's final chapter. I am bearing witness until there is nothing left to witness and no one left to bear it. The smell grows stronger, the invasion approaches, and I am still here, still recording, until I am not.